That icy gaze of hers never leaves my memory. The cutting words spoken without hesitation before the entire family gathered in the living room. "You're useless." "Just a miserable burden," she hissed, laughing as everyone watched. They applauded, agreed, treated me like trash. Not even my own husband raised his voice to defend me. He just sat there staring at the floor as if he found something fascinating in the patterns of the carpet I had cleaned that very morning. The truth I had carried hidden for years could have turned that laughter into silence and their greed into shame. But in that moment, I choked back tears as I had so many times lowered my head and left the room as laughter echoed behind me. If you've made it this far, you've probably recognized that families aren't always what we imagine right here on this channel. You'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are told without judgment. These stories will move you, make you reflect, and perhaps even help you better understand your own family experiences. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community where every story matters and where you're always welcome. Now I'll tell you all the details of this experience that changed my life forever. My name is Helena. I'm 42 years old, and exactly 5 years ago, I was a shadow of the woman I am today. Born and raised in a small rural town, I always dreamed of a better life of opportunities my parents never had. I studied, worked hard, and saved every penny to move to New York, the city of dreams. I remember the day I arrived as if it were yesterday. It was a gray autumn day, the kind of day that seems straight out of a movie. I had only 2 large suitcases savings that would have lasted 3 months if I lived extremely cautiously, and dreams too big to fit into my small shared apartment in the Bronx. The first few months were difficult, harder than I would ever admit to my parents during our weekly phone calls. I got a job as a waitress at a downtown restaurant where my accent was seen as charming by customers who often left generous tips for the Brazilian girl. In my spare time, I did small translation jobs, capitalizing on my fluency in Portuguese and Spanish. I studied English obsessively every night, determined to eliminate any trace of accent that might immediately identify me as a foreigner. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be seen as an equal. It was on one of those exhausting days after a double shift at the restaurant that I met Richard. He was a regular, always ordering the same thing, bourbon on the rocks and a medium rare steak. He always sat at the same table by the window, usually alone with his work documents spread out across the table. I noticed how he watched me as I passed, how his eyes followed my movements as I served other tables. It wasn't a predatory look, but an attentive, curious one. By the 3rd week, he finally said something beyond his usual order. "Your English is improving." He smiled, closing the folder. "But you still carry the music of Portuguese in your words. It's charming." I blushed, surprised by the comment and the detailed observation. "Thank you. I'm trying to improve." "Don't try too hard." He took a sip of his bourbon. "That accent is part of your charm." "I'm Richard, by the way." "Richard Walker." "Helena," I replied reflexively, reaching out. "Helena Santos." He held my hand for a moment longer than was appropriate, his blue eyes never leaving mine. "Helena, a beautiful name for a beautiful woman." That was the beginning. We exchanged numbers that same night. He began showing up more frequently, always asking to be placed in my section. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book he'd mentioned in some conversation, a handmade chocolate that reminded me of a small bottle of French perfume that would suit my personality. They were delicate, thoughtful gestures, the kind of things that make a young woman alone in a foreign country feel special, noticed, valued. Our first official outing was to a concert in Central Park. Richard showed up with a full picnic wine, imported cheeses, fresh fruit, even a small basket of artisanal bread. We sat on a blanket under the stars, listening to Mozart as he told me about his privileged childhood in Connecticut, his years at Yale University, his rising career in marketing. He spoke with the confidence of someone who never had to doubt his place in the world, who never had to prove his worth or fight for basic opportunities. "And you?" he asked, finally pouring more wine into my glass. "What was it like growing up in Brazil?" I hesitated. My story didn't have the same sparkle as his. The daughter of a public school teacher and a seamstress, I grew up in a modest home where money was always Carefully counted gifts were rare and luxuries were practically non-existent. I attended public schools where books were shared and teachers frequently went on strike for better pay. I worked from the age of 16 to help out at home and save money. For college, which I attended at night while working during the day, it was different, I finally replied. We had fewer material things, but a lot of joy. My parents are wonderful people who sacrificed a lot to give me an education. Richard smiled that smile. I still couldn't quite interpret. Simple yet honest people, aren't they? I've always admired that. The ability to find happiness with so little. There was something in his tone that should have tipped me off a certain condescension, disguised as admiration. But I was too dazzled by his attention, by the fact that a man like him who could have any woman had chosen me. Our relationship progressed quickly. Within 2 weeks, he had already introduced me to a few close friends, all successful businessmen, with impeccably dressed wives and polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Within a month, he began taking me to corporate events as his official date. Within 2 months, he was leaving clothes at my apartment and talking about how much more convenient it would be if we lived together. Your apartment is quaint, he commented one night, looking around the small space I shared with 2 other immigrants, a Polish woman and a Filipina. But you deserve better. My apartment in Manhattan has plenty of space. You'd save on rent, on transportation. It makes sense. Don't you think it made sense, actually? My rent ate up almost half my salary, and Richard's apartment was a luxurious duplex overlooking the park. But there was something about his offer that made me uneasy, a sense of dependence. I wasn't sure I wanted to establish so soon. I voiced my doubts carefully. That's very kind, Richard, but I don't think I'm ready for that step. I like my independence. His face fell momentarily, a shadow passing over his eyes, quickly replaced by an understanding smile. Of course, dear. I respect that. Independence is important, especially for someone with your history. My history, you know, coming from where you come from. Having achieved everything on your own, he caressed my face. It's admirable. We'll take our time, but his timing proved to be much faster than mine. 3 months after that conversation, on a seemingly ordinary evening, he took me to dinner at the top of the Empire State Building. The entire restaurant had been reserved for the 2 of us, the tables decorated with red roses, a string quartet playing softly in the corner. When dessert arrived, there was a small velvet box on the plate. Helena Santos, he said, kneeling beside me as the waiter discreetly walked away, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The ring inside the box was stunning, a solitaire diamond weighing at least 3 carats, surrounded by tiny sapphires that perfectly matched Richard's eyes. It was the kind of ring I'd only seen in movies, the kind of proposal that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. Richard, we've only known each other for 6 months, I protested weakly, my heart pounding. And they were the best 6 months of my life. He replied promptly, with the confidence of a man who rarely hears no for an answer. When you know, you just know. And I know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. How could I say no to something like that? How could I resist the promise of a love so intense, so self-assured? How could I deny the opportunity to finally belong to someone, to have a defined place in the world? I said yes, of course. I ignored the little voice inside me that questioned, the speed of everything that wondered why he was so eager to seal our commitment. The wedding was planned in record time, just 2 months after the engagement. Richard insisted on a small event, just family and close friends. I tried to argue that I would have liked my parents to be there, but he was quick to point out the difficulties. They'd need visas, expensive flights, and lodging. It would be a huge expense for them, and you said your father has health problems. The trip would be very exhausting. He kissed my forehead. We can visit them later when things are more stable. We'll have a small celebration there too. It seemed reasonable. Pragmatic, even. One of the qualities I admired in Richard was his practicality, his ability to make difficult decisions without being swayed by emotion. I agreed, ignoring the tightness in my chest at the thought of getting married without my family present. The wedding took place in a small chapel outside New York City, decorated with white and blue flowers, Richard's chosen colors. My dress, also selected by him, was elegant and understated sophisticated without being extravagant as he described it. The guests were mostly from his side, about 50 people, all impeccably dressed, all watching me with that same polite smile that never reached their eyes. It was on that day that I met the entire Walker family. Judith Richards' mother was a tall, thin woman with perfectly dyed gray hair and jewelry that sparkled discreetly under the chapel lights. She approached me before the ceremony, looking me up and down with a critical eye. "So you're the Brazilian girl who won my son over," she said, not quite as a question. "I must say, you're not what I expected." "And what did you expect, Mrs. Walker?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though I could already feel the tension rising. "Someone more compatible with our lifestyle, I suppose." Richard always had peculiar taste. She adjusted a lock of my hair, a gesture that felt both maternal and invasive. "But he chose you, and we respect his choices, even the most unlikely ones." Richard's father, Harold, was less subtle in his assessment. A burly man with a neatly trimmed mustache and calculating eyes, he greeted me with a handshake that was too firm. "So you're Richard's newest addition," he commented, chuckling at his own joke while I tried not to show discomfort. "I hope you appreciate your good fortune, young man. It's not just any girl of your ... circumstances who makes it into the Walker family." Richard's sister, Samantha, arrived late with her twins, Oliver and Emma, 8-year-olds with bored expressions and clothes that probably cost more than everything I'd ever owned. She hugged me briefly, a shallow embrace that barely touched my body. "Welcome to the family," she said, her smile at odds with her cold eyes. "Richard has always had a weakness for ... exoticism. I hope you adapt well to our dynamic." Not everyone does. Throughout the ceremony, as we exchanged vows and rings, as Richard promised to love and respect me forever, I couldn't ignore the Walker family's gazes. The way they whispered to each other, the way they watched me as if I were a rare specimen on display. Richard seemed oblivious to it all. Or perhaps, and this thought would only occur to me much later, he simply didn't care. The reception was held at a private club, one of those exclusive places where Manhattan's old money gathers to celebrate away from the public eye. The food was excellent, the imported champagne flowed freely, the band played smooth, elegant music. Everything was perfectly appropriate, perfectly controlled. No Brazilian music, no traditions from my culture. When I mentioned this to Richard, he laughed. "Honey, no one here would appreciate that. Besides, you're a Walker now. You need to embrace our traditions." And so began my new life as Helena Walker. We moved into a house in the suburbs, not as luxurious as Richard's Manhattan apartment, but still far grander than anywhere I'd ever lived. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a sprawling garden, and a kitchen straight out of a home decor magazine. Richard explained that we'd better start saving for the future, for the children we'd soon have. That it was time to be practical, to think long term. "My salary is more than enough for both of us," he said, when I suggested looking for a job. "Besides, I want you to dedicate yourself to creating a real home for us. Learn to cook dishes. I like decorate the house in the appropriate style. Prepare yourself to be a great mother." I agreed, though. A part of me already missed the independence, the simple pleasure of earning my own money, making my own decisions. But Richard was right, wasn't he? He had given me an incredible opportunity, had elevated me to a world I could never have accessed alone. The least I could do was adapt to be the wife he deserved. The first months of marriage were a constant attempt to please. I learned to cook Richard's favorite dishes, exactly how he liked them: the steak, always cooked to medium rare; the potatoes, always crispy on the outside and tender on the inside; the gravy, always the perfect consistency. I decorated the house according to the magazines Judith kindly sent me, with a passive-aggressive note about how even people without a design degree can create decent spaces with the right guidance. I began dressing like the wives of Richard's friends. Expensive but understated clothes, simple but conspicuously expensive jewelry, hair always impeccably groomed. And then the family started coming over. At first once a month. Formal dinners where I spent the whole day cooking and cleaning, only to hear subtly critical comments about every aspect of the meal, the house, my appearance. Judith, always inspecting the corners for dust. Harold, always asking questions about how much things had cost Samantha, always letting her. Children run around the house knocking over objects and dirtying freshly cleaned furniture. The silver isn't polished properly, dear, Judith commented, running her finger over a fork and wrinkling her nose. In our family, we have standards to uphold. Perhaps I should give you some lessons. Clearly, you haven't had the opportunity to learn these things, before this. Wine is acceptable, but hardly exceptional, Harold would say, swirling his glass dismissively. At $800 a bottle, I'd expect something more refined. But I suppose you're still developing your palate, aren't you, Helena? The kids are just expressing themselves. Samantha would justify as the twins spilled juice on the Persian rug I'd spent the morning cleaning. That's how healthy kids behave. But you don't have kids yet, so you wouldn't understand, would you, Richard? Watched silently sometimes with an embarrassed smile, other times openly agreeing with his family. Helena really needs to improve her English, doesn't she? Sometimes I don't even understand what she's trying to say. Or, yes, Mom, I also noticed the house could be cleaner. I'll talk to her about it. These monthly visits soon became bi-weekly, then weekly. Each Sunday, the entire Walker family would show up for lunch, often staying until dinner, sometimes late into the night. My Sundays, which should have been days of rest, became marathons of service and humiliation. And Richard, far from protecting me, seemed content with the arrangement, as if it were perfectly natural for his wife to be treated like a servant in his own home. "They're my family, Helena," he'd say, when I exhausted questioned the frequency of his visits. "Family is important. You should understand that considering yours is so far away. You should be grateful that I share mine with you." The mention of my family always silenced me. The truth is, I missed them terribly. The weekly calls with my parents had become monthly after the wedding. Richard always had something more important to do at the times I usually called, and he always reminded me how much international calls cost. The letters I wrote regularly were forgotten to be mailed or mysteriously disappeared from the desk where I left them. The promise to visit Brazil after the wedding never materialized. There was always a reason to postpone a work emergency, an unforgettable commitment. "Maybe next year," Richard would say whenever I mentioned the possibility. "Now's not a good time. Besides, do you really want me to see that place from everything you've told me, it seems?" Well, primitive. That's how he referred to my country, my culture, my origins. Over time, I began to notice how Richard subtly dismissed everything about Brazil. The food was strangely seasoned, the music was loud, the people were disorderly. When we rarely encountered other Brazilians, at social events, he made a point of quickly pushing me away, inventing some urgent appointment or some important person we needed to greet across the room. "I don't want you to be distracted by that kind of company," he explained once, after practically dragging me away from a friendly Brazilian lady who had recognized me by my accent. "You're here to build useful connections, not to reminisce with people like that. People like that. People like me," he meant. People who weren't born with silver spoons, who didn't attend elite schools, who didn't have familiar surnames or hefty bank accounts. I began to realize slowly and painfully that Richard hadn't married me despite my background, but because of it. He wanted someone malleable, someone he could mold and control, someone eternally grateful for the opportunity to enter his exclusive world. When I finally got pregnant after a year of marriage, I thought everything would change, that I would finally be accepted as an integral part of the family, that Judith would see me as the mother of her grandchild, that Richard would look at me with those loving eyes from the early days. For a few weeks, that was exactly how it was. Richard proudly announced the pregnancy during a family dinner. Judith hugged me almost sincerely. Harold talked about opening an investment account for the baby. Samantha offered clothes that no longer fit the twins. For the first time since the wedding, I felt truly part of the Walker family. Richard was attentive again, bringing me little gifts again, and taking an interest in my well-being again. We began planning the baby's room, discussing names, and imagining what our life as parents would be like. For a brief moment, I regained hope that our marriage could be what I had initially dreamed. But then in the third month, I started bleeding. Richard took me to the hospital, immediately holding my hand tightly while we waited for the doctor. The diagnosis was devastating: a miscarriage. The doctor explained that it was common, occurring in about 20% of known pregnancies, that there was nothing wrong with me, and that we could try again in a few months. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker," he said gently. "I know how difficult this is, but you are both young and healthy. There is no reason to believe you won't be able to have children in the future." During the procedure to remove the fetal tissue, Richard held my hand, but his touch was mechanical, devoid of warmth. His eyes avoided mine, fixed on the ceiling, the walls, the floor, anywhere other than my face, contorted with physical and emotional pain. When it was over and the doctor left us alone to recover, he finally looked at me. There was no compassion in his eyes, only a calculating coldness I had never noticed before. "Maybe it's for the best," he commented on the way home. "We hadn't planned it anyway. And you're clearly not ready to be a mother. You can barely keep the house in order, let alone with a baby to take care of." Those words hit me like a slap, but I choked back tears. "He's just hurt," I tried to convince myself. "He's dealing with his own grief, processing the loss in his own way." Men often have difficulty expressing vulnerability, showing sadness. That's what my mother always said about my father, who also tended to withdraw in times of crisis. But his family wasn't as subtle as Richard in their reaction to the loss of the baby. The following Sunday during the lunch, I insisted on preparing despite still recovering physically. Judith made a point of mentioning all the women she knew who had had miscarriages. "There's usually something wrong with them, you know," she commented, casually cutting into her chicken as if dissecting a specimen. "The female body was made to reproduce. If it fails at that, well, there's something fundamentally flawed." Harold, ever practical, approached the issue from a different angle. "Children are investments in the future, and investments always involve risk. Perhaps you should reconsider your plans. There are other ways to leave a legacy." Samantha, as always, was the most direct. As her children ran around the house screaming, she looked at me with a mixture of disdain and mock pity. "I'm not surprised. You're of different races, aren't you?" Her body probably rejected the baby because it wasn't genetically compatible. Richard said nothing. He simply poured more wine for everyone, avoiding my gaze as he had in the hospital. In that moment, sitting at the table with a family, discussing my body, my loss, my supposed inadequacy, without any regard for my feelings, I realized I was completely alone, that these people, bound by blood and privilege, would never see me as an equal, would never truly accept me as part of their inner circle. In the months that followed, things only got worse. Richard began arriving home from work later and later. When questioned, he'd say he was busy, that I didn't understand the pressures of the corporate world, that he needed to make sacrifices for our comfortable life. I began to notice small changes in our budget as well. The credit card we shared was increasingly charged for expensive lunchtime restaurants and women's department stores I'd never frequented. When I mentioned this, Richard exploded. "Are you accusing me of something, Helena? After everything I do for you, I give you a roof over your head, food on your table, clothes on your back, and you question me about how I spend my money. Who do you think you are?" The anger in his voice startled me, made me recoil. I'd never seen him like this before, his face flushed with fury, his eyes gleaming dangerously, the veins in his neck bulging. I apologized immediately, promised I'd never ask again, that I trusted him completely. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I began to pay more attention, to notice patterns. Richard not only arrived late, but he also returned home smelling strange. Sometimes a perfume that wasn't mine, sometimes with a wrinkled shirt or lipstick stains on the collar that he tried to hide. When I called his office, his secretary often said he had gone out to lunch with clients but wouldn't be back that afternoon. I tried to ignore the signs, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was allowing stress and loneliness to distort my perception. But then, one particularly painful afternoon, I received an unexpected call. A woman with an elegant voice asking for Richard. When I explained that he was at work, she laughed. "At work, honey. Richard took the afternoon off." We're at the plaza right now celebrating our 3-month anniversary. Wait, who are you? My heart felt like it was going too. Burst out of my chest as I replied, my voice breaking, I'm his wife. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a whispered, "Oh my God," and the sound of the call being ended. I spent the next few hours in a daze, alternating between angry tears and periods of strange, disconnected calm. When Richard finally arrived home around 9 o'clock, I was prepared to confront him. He walked into the living room where I sat rigidly on the couch, my face lined with tears. "What happened?" he asked, looking genuinely concerned for a moment. "Are you okay? Where were you this afternoon, Richard?" I asked directly, my voice firmer than I expected. He hesitated for a moment, almost imperceptibly, before answering with studied casualness. "In the office, of course. We had an important meeting about the Westridge campaign." "Why, interesting. Because when I called your office, Brenda said you'd left after lunch and wouldn't be back." Another moment of hesitation. It's a flash of calculation in his eyes. "Oh yes, I forgot to mention, I had an off-site meeting with clients. I should have let you know." "No," the plaza, his face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Yes, exactly. They're staying there." "How did you know?" "Because your lover called here this afternoon. Apparently, you were celebrating 3 months together." "Congratulations, Richard." "I hope the cake was good." For a moment, he seemed completely speechless, as if he couldn't decide which line of defense to pursue. Then, to my surprise, his face transformed into a mask of irritation, as if I were the wrong person in this situation. "So that's it. You're spying on my life, interrogating my secretary, making accusations based on a phone call that could be from anyone. Maybe some crazy woman trying to cause trouble in our marriage." Her attempt to turn the situation around was so absurd, I almost laughed. "Richard, she knew your name, she knew where you were, she knew how long you'd been together. She didn't seem surprised that you were with her instead of at the office. The only person surprised by that call was me." Realizing denial wouldn't work, Richard changed tactics. His face took on an expression of resigned weariness, as if he were the victim of an inevitable situation. "Okay, Helena? Yes, I'm seeing someone else. Several, actually, if you want to know the whole truth." "Does it really matter? It's just sex." "It doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. You're betraying your marriage vows and saying it means nothing," he sighed, as if explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. "Look, men like me in positions like mine have certain ... needs. It's perfectly natural. Practically all my colleagues do the same. Their wives understand, or at least pretend not to. It's an arrangement that works. I don't understand, Richard, and I'm not willing to pretend." "What did you expect, Helena?" His voice now held a deliberate cruelty. "Since you lost the baby, you've never been the same. You're always sad, always crying in the corners. A man in my position needs a woman who makes him feel good, who supports him, not someone who only knows how to complain and make demands." It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. Suddenly, all the cruel little comments, all the veiled criticisms, all the times he'd made me feel less than I was, made sense. It wasn't love what Richard felt for me. Maybe it never had been. It was control. It was the satisfaction of having someone completely dependent on him, someone he could mold and manipulate to his will. "You never loved me, did you?" I asked, the tears drying on my face. "I was just, what, a project, an exotic toy to show off to your friends. A convenient maid you could use when you weren't busy with your mistresses." He laughed, a cold, calculated sound. "Don't be dramatic, Helena. Of course, I loved you in my own way. You were refreshing, different from the women I usually date. There was something charming about your naivete, about your gratitude for every little gesture. It was almost comforting seeing how happy you were about things that had always been trivial to me, like an owner appreciating the gratitude of a stray dog he rescues, right? If you want to put it that way, ... double quotes," he shrugged, not denying the comparison. "Look, we can continue as we are. You have a good life here, much better than you would have in Brazil. I provide all of that. In return, I just ask that you be realistic about what our marriage is. A partnership that suits us both." In that moment, looking at the man I had married, for whom I had abandoned my career, my independence, my dreams. I felt something die inside me. The last vestige of love, of hope, of illusion. And in its place, something new began to grow. A cold determination, a clarity of purpose I had never experienced before. "I'll think about what you said," I finally replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Now, if you don't mind, I need some time alone." Richard seemed surprised by my subdued reaction. He'd probably expected screams, tears, pleas, maybe even a threat of divorce, which he could easily dissuade by reminding me of my complete financial dependence. But my calm momentarily disconcerted him. "Sure, sure," he murmured, clearly relieved to avoid an emotional scene. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. We'll talk more tomorrow when we're both calmer." That same night, while he slept, I accessed his computer. The password was easy: the name of his first dog, followed by the year he graduated from college. I found emails, conversations, photos. It wasn't just one lover. There were several at different points from the beginning of our marriage. There was the elegant blonde who worked at his company, the sophisticated redhead who was the wife of one of his clients, the young brunette who appeared to be some kind of assistant or intern. All of them receiving the same messages, the same compliments, the same gifts that I had once received. The same charming and attentive Richard who had won me over was apparently simultaneously winning over several other women. But there was more, much more. Financial documents showing offshore accounts, suspicious transfers, contracts with dubious clauses. Richard wasn't just unfaithful. He was dishonest in every area of his life. I saw emails discussing how to circumvent regulations, how to reinterpret ethical guidelines, how to minimize tax liabilities through methods that seemed clearly illegal even to me with my limited knowledge of finance. I wanted to confront him immediately, but something stopped me. The realization that I was completely vulnerable. I had no job, no savings, nowhere to go. My family in Brazil was barely making ends meet. They couldn't help me return. I was trapped in a foreign country with a man who clearly didn't love me and a family who despised me. I needed a plan. In the months that followed, I maintained a facade of normalcy. I continued to be the perfect wife, taking care of the house, welcoming his family with polite smiles, pretending I didn't know anything. We fell back into a seemingly normal routine. Continued to arrive late, and I continued to pretend to believe his excuses. He occasionally took me to social events where he paraded me around as his charming Brazilian wife, and I smiled and dutifully played my part. But secretly, I began to prepare. First, I found our marriage documents, our bank contracts, anything that might be legally useful. I made copies, which I carefully hid. Then I got a job as a waitress at a restaurant far from our home during the hours Richard was at the office. I told the manager I needed to be paid in cash, making up a story about problems with my immigration status. The money wasn't much, but it was mine, kept in a coffee can in the back of a cupboard where Richard would never look. I started taking online English classes, improving my pronunciation, and expanding my vocabulary. I studied while he was at work, quickly erasing any trace of my studies before he got home. And most importantly, I began gathering evidence. Copies of emails, bank statements, recordings of phone conversations in which he discussed questionable transactions. I kept everything on a flash drive I always carried with me, hidden in a secret compartment in my bag. The plan was simple: save enough to support myself for a few months, find a place to live, and then file for divorce with enough evidence to ensure I received fair compensation. I didn't want revenge, just justice, just enough to start my life over with dignity. But then one Sunday afternoon, everything changed. The family was gathered at our house as usual. Judith was criticizing my decor. Harold was talking about his investments. Samantha was allowing the twins to destroy my newly planted garden. Richard was particularly irritated that day. A discussion with a client had gone wrong, and his boss had questioned his competence. I became the perfect target for his frustration. "Helena, this sauce is bland." As usual. He pushed the plate away, causing some sauce to splatter onto the tablecloth I'd spent all morning preparing. "I don't know why I keep expecting you to do something right." Judith readily agreed. "Perhaps we should teach her some Walker family recipes, although I doubt she'll be able to master them. Some people are just not cut out for certain standards of excellence. Let's be honest, Samantha, added, cutting a piece of meat as if dissecting something unpleasant. She'll never really be one of us. There's a certain quality missing. A finesse, an understanding of how things work in families like ours. Richard smiled that cruel smile I'd come to know so well. She's useless in the kitchen, useless in bed, useless with money. Basically, useless at everything. Just a miserable burden I carry for. Well, I don't even know why anymore. They laughed. All of them. As if my existence were a private joke they shared. As if I weren't sitting right there listening to every word, feeling every insult like a knife. Richard didn't even have the decency to avoid my gaze as he humiliated me in front of his family. On the contrary, he seemed to derive perverse pleasure from seeing the tears I desperately tried to hold back. I choked back tears as I had so many times before. I lowered my head and left the room, their laughter echoing behind me. I slowly climbed the stairs, entered our bedroom, and closed the door. And then something broke inside me. It wasn't sadness I felt, or shame, or fear. It was rage. A pure crystalline rage that clarified my thoughts like never before. At that moment, I made a decision. I would wait no longer. I would no longer save money, no longer plan carefully, no longer endure another day of humiliation. I opened my laptop and accessed the folder where I had stored all the evidence against Richard. Emails proving his infidelities, financial documents revealing his fraud, recordings of his unconscious confessions. During phone conversations, with my hand shaking, not with fear but with determination, I began to prepare an email. To Richard's boss, to his partners, to the company's internal audit department, to the IRS, to everyone who needed to know exactly what kind of man Richard Walker really was. I attached all the documents, all the evidence, everything I had meticulously gathered during those months of silent planning. In the body of the email, I simply wrote, "The truth about Richard Walker from his wife, who is no longer a miserable burden." I hit send before I could change my mind. Then I grabbed my purse where I kept my most important documents and the money I had saved. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a few weeks in a cheap hotel while I organized my next steps. I went back downstairs through the dining room, where they continued laughing and drinking as if nothing had happened. Richard looked up, surprised to see me with my bag over my shoulder. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, more curious than concerned. I looked at each of them for a long moment. At Judith with her constant disdain. At Harold with his calculating coldness. At Samantha with her petty pleasure in seeing me humiliated. And finally at Richard, the man I had loved, who had promised to care for me, honor me, respect me. "I'm leaving, Richard. I'm no longer your burden to carry." He laughed, looking at his family as if sharing a joke. "And where exactly are you going, with no money, no friends, no family in this country, sleeping on the streets?" "I have enough money. And as for friends, we'll soon find out who really has friends. In this room, won't we?" The confusion on his face was almost comical. "What are you talking about? Check your work email. Actually, have your boss checked theirs too. And maybe the finance department. Oh, and the IRS will probably be in touch soon." I kept my voice calm, controlled, despite my heart pounding in my chest. Richard's expression slowly changed from amusement to confusion, and then to horror as realization finally dawned on him. "You didn't do it. You couldn't have. You spent 3 years convincing me I'm useless, Richard." "Maybe I am. But I've discovered I'm very good at keeping secrets. Yours specifically." He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "You ungrateful bitch, after everything I've done for you, what have you done for me?" Richard humiliated me, betrayed me, made me feel less than human. He advanced toward me, his face contorted with rage. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to physically attack me. But something in my posture and the firmness of my gaze made him stop. Perhaps it was the first time he truly saw me. Not as the vulnerable, dependent immigrant he had manipulated for years, but as a woman who had finally regained her dignity, her strength. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "I'll destroy you." I shook my head, feeling a surprising calm. "No, Richard. You already tried to destroy me. For 3 years, every word, every gesture, every humiliation was designed to break me. But I'm here, whole, stronger than ever. And you just lost everything." As if in response to my words, Richard's cell phone began to ring. He picked it up mechanically and stared at the screen. The color drained from his face. "It's my boss." He smiled, not maliciously, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has finally achieved justice. "Better answer that?" "It seems important." I left the room as Richard answered the call with trembling hands. Judith frantically asked what was going on, and Harold checked his own phone with an alarmed expression. I walked out the front door without looking back, feeling the cool night air like a promise of freedom. The days that followed were a whirlwind. I rented a room in a modest hotel, hired a lawyer with part of my savings, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The evidence I had submitted was devastating. Richard was suspended from his job while an internal investigation was conducted. Bank accounts were frozen, auditors were called in, and the police began asking questions about certain financial transactions that crossed the line of legality. For the first week after I left, Richard tried to contact me incessantly. First with angry, threatening messages promising to destroy me if I didn't drop the charges. Then with pleas attempts at emotional manipulation, reminding me of everything he'd done for me, how I would be nothing without him. Finally, with desperate pleas, begging for forgiveness, swearing he would change, that he loved me, that he couldn't live without me. I ignored them all. I blocked her number, instructed the hotel not to forward her calls, and asked my lawyer to handle any necessary communications. I was determined to move on, not to look back, not to give in to the same manipulation that had kept me trapped for so long. When we finally met, it was in a conference room in my lawyer's office. Richard looked as if he had aged a decade in just a few weeks. His impeccable suit couldn't disguise his haggard look, his sunken eyes, his defeated expression. His lawyer, a gray-haired man with a stern expression, spoke first. "My client is willing to offer a generous divorce settlement to bring this matter to a close as quickly as possible." My lawyer, a middle-aged woman with shrewd eyes and a confident smile, replied calmly, "We are listening." The terms of the settlement were more than I could have ever hoped for. Half of all the couple's assets, including the house investments and bank accounts. A substantial monthly pension for 5 years, enough time for me to establish myself professionally. The condition that I drop the charges, that I admit I had sent the emails in a moment of emotional distress, that the documents had been misinterpreted. I looked at Richard, really looked at him, trying to find some trace of the man I thought I loved. There was nothing there but despair and resentment. No regret, no awareness of the harm he'd caused. Only fear of the consequences of his own actions. "No," I replied simply. Richard looked up, surprised. What I said? No. I will not lie to save your reputation or your freedom. I will not say I made up things that are true. I will not shield you from the consequences of your own choices. Are you crazy? I'm offering you more money than you've ever seen in your life. Dirty money, Richard. Money stolen from people who trusted you. Money stained by the tears you made me shed. I'd rather earn my own money honestly than accept a penny that makes me your accomplice." My lawyer smiled softly, clearly impressed by my poise. "My client is willing to accept your financial offer as reparations for the emotional and psychological damage she suffered during the marriage. But she will not remove any evidence, make no false statements, and will cooperate fully with any ongoing investigation." Richard's lawyer started to protest, but Richard cut him off with a gesture. For the first time, I saw something different in his eyes. It wasn't regret, it wasn't love, but perhaps a glimmer of respect. "You win, Helena. Take the money and do whatever you want. Just don't expect me to go to jail without a fight. I never expected less from you, Richard. You've always been a fighter. You just picked the wrong battles and the wrong opponents." The divorce was finalized in record time. Investigations against Richard continued, eventually resulting in criminal charges for tax fraud and embezzlement of corporate funds. His family, predictable as ever, closed ranks around him. Judith gave interviews defending her model son, victim of a foreign con artist. Harold used his connections to try to mitigate the legal consequences. Samantha spread rumors about my alleged mental instability, my fabricated history of troubles in Brazil, and my healthy obsession with her brother. The local press picked up the story, fascinated by the spectacle of a successful marketing executive being brought down by his own immigrant wife. There were sensational headline speculation about my motives and attempts to contact me for interviews that I consistently refused. I didn't want fame or public attention. I simply wanted justice and a fresh start. One day, about 3 months after our separation, I received an unexpected call. It was Brenda Richards' secretary, the same one who had so often told me he was in a meeting or busy with clients when in fact he was with his lovers. Helena, I hope I'm not bothering you. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I needed to thank you. Thank me for what there was a pause followed by a heavy sigh. For having the courage I never had. Richard wasn't just my boss, he was. Well, you know how he was. What he did, how he treated women. I was one of them for a while until I realized I wasn't special, that I was just another one in his collection. But I kept working for him, kept lying for him, kept letting him do to others what he'd done to me, including you. I was silent, processing his words, the unexpected confession, the guilt in his voice. When you exposed him, she continued, it was like something inside me was released too. The truth finally came out, and with it a chance at redemption. I'm cooperating with the investigation, now telling everything I know. It's scary, but also liberating, and I owe it to you. I didn't know what to say right away. Part of me wanted to blame her for her complicity for having enabled Richard's behavior, for having been part of the system that had kept me in ignorance for so long. But another part understood her vulnerability, recognized that she too had been a victim in her own way. Thank you for telling me this, Brenda. I hope you find peace. You too, Helena. And just so you know, there are so many of us. So many women Richard has hurt, manipulated, discarded. We're all watching you, admiring your courage, wishing we could have been as strong as you. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized my story wasn't unique, that there were other women with similar experiences, that what I had done wasn't just for me, but for all of them too. I began to consider ways to turn my pain into something positive, to use my experience to help others in similar situations. With the settlement money, I rented a small apartment, went back to school, completed my degree in business administration, and eventually opened my own consulting firm specializing in helping immigrants establish themselves in the United States. My personal experience became my greatest professional tool. I understood the vulnerabilities, challenges, and pitfalls that people in similar situations faced. I created a mentoring program specifically for immigrant women, offering guidance on legal rights, professional opportunities, and financial independence. I organized support groups where they could share their stories, their struggles, and their victories. I established partnerships with law firms willing to offer pro bono services to women in abusive relationships. I transformed my pain into purpose, my experience into shared wisdom. A year after leaving Richard, I finally managed to fulfill a dream he had systematically sabotaged. I returned to Brazil to visit my parents. When I saw them waiting at the airport, my father thinner and grayer than I remembered, my mother with new wrinkles around her eyes, but the same loving smile, I felt like a circle had closed. I hugged them tightly, letting the tears flow freely, feeling the unconditional love Richard had never been able to offer. During those 2 weeks at home, I told them everything. Not the edited, optimistic versions I'd shared during our rare calls, but the full, painful truth. How I'd been manipulated and controlled, how I'd lost my identity and my voice, how I'd finally found the courage to break free. They listened in silence, holding my hands, occasionally wiping away tears, theirs and mine. We always knew something was wrong, my mother confessed. The way your calls became less frequent, the way your voice changed, the way you avoided certain topics. We wanted to help, but we didn't know how. We didn't have the resources to reach you. I'm so proud of you. Daughter, my father said, his voice choked with emotion. Not for marrying a rich American, as everyone here thought, but for finding the strength to leave when you realized it wasn't right. That to me is worth more than any wealth or status. Those words, simple yet deeply sincere, healed something in me. I hadn't even known was still broken. The approval I desperately sought from the Walker family, the recognition Richard had always withheld as a form of control, the love I tried to buy with submission and sacrifice it was all. They're freely offered by my parents without conditions or expectations. Upon returning to the United States, I felt renewed strengthened not only by my own journey of self-discovery, but also by the love and support of my family. I continued building my new life, expanding my business, and expanding my work with immigrant women. I began giving lectures at universities and community centers about abusive relationships, warning signs, and escape strategies. I wrote a book about my experience not as a sensationalist expose, but as a practical guide for others in similar situations. As for Richard, I learned from mutual acquaintances that he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, serving 18 months before being released on good behavior. His career was ruined, his reputation destroyed. The last I heard from him, he was working in a low-level position at a small company owned by a friend of Harold's, living in a modest apartment, trying to rebuild his life from the pieces. I could feel satisfaction with his fate, perhaps even pleasure in the idea that he finally faced the consequences of his actions. But the truth is, I feel nothing more than a slight sadness for the wasted potential for the loss of humanity that greed and selfishness have wrought. Richard could have been a good man, a good husband, if he had made different choices. Just as I could have remained a victim if I hadn't found the courage to stand up for myself. One autumn afternoon, exactly 5 years after that fateful dinner where I was called a useless burden, I received an envelope at my company's office. There was no return address, just my name written in a handwriting I immediately recognized. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what Richard could possibly want after all this time. Inside was only a short note. Helena, I've never been good at admitting mistakes or apologizing. I still am not. But after 5 years of forced reflection, I've realized some truths that perhaps you deserve to hear. You were never a burden. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too arrogant, too blind to realize it. While you built, I destroyed. While you loved, I manipulated. While you grew, I diminished. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that of all the painful lessons I've learned, the most important was this. You were always extraordinary. I was just too ordinary to recognize it. I wish you all the happiness that I didn't know how to value. Richard, I read the letter over and over, searching for hidden manipulation, veiled attempts to reconnect any sign of old patterns. But I found nothing beyond the words themselves. Imperfect, belated, but seemingly sincere. I didn't respond. There was no need. Our paths had completely parted, our lives heading in irreconcilably different directions. I put the letter in a drawer and returned to work to the purpose I had built from the ashes of our marriage. Today, I am a different woman from the dazzled young woman who arrived in New York with 2 suitcases and immense dreams. Stronger, wiser, more compassionate. I learned that a person's worth lies not in what others say about them, but in what they know about themselves. I learned that courage doesn't always roar like a lion sometimes. It whispers persistently day after day until it finally finds its full voice. I learned that true relationships are built on mutual respect and equality, not on power and control. My life is now rich in ways Richard could never comprehend, rich in purpose, in genuine connections, in personal growth. I have true friends who know and value me for who I am, not for what I can offer. I have meaningful work that allows me to use my own pain to ease the pain of others. I have a renewed relationship with my family based on honesty and unconditional love. And most importantly, I have myself, not the diminished version Richard tried to create, but the complete, complex, capable woman I've always been, even when I couldn't see it. If you're going through something similar, feeling diminished, invalidated, manipulated by someone who should love you, know that there is a way out. There is strength within you, even if you haven't discovered it yet. There is dignity within you that no one can take away unless you allow it. There is a future waiting for you beyond abuse and manipulation. My story isn't unique, unfortunately, but my ending can be inspiring to anyone who needs to hear it. You are not a burden. You are not useless. You are valuable, capable, worthy of respect and true love. And if no one around you recognizes this, maybe it's time to do as I did. Grab your bag, hold your head high, and walk out the door toward the freedom you deserve. The truth I carried for years turned their laughter into silence and their greed into shame. But most importantly, it turned my pain into power, my silence into voice, my submission into freedom. And that is the most powerful truth of all. If you identified with my story, leave a like to help me reach more people. In the comments, tell me, have you ever been through something similar or know someone who has? What part of the story resonated with you the most? Subscribe to the channel for more real stories like this, stories that show that even in the most difficult situations, there is always hope, always a path to dignity and self-determination. Together, we can transform our pain into strength, our scars into wisdom, our stories into inspiration.